In 2012, a group of criminals pulled off the most Canadian heist in history. They stole $18 million worth of maple syrup, and somehow, this sticky situation became an international incident that exposed a conspiracy so insane it makes the Mafia look like a neighborhood book club. This is the story of how liquid gold turned into blood money, and how the most polite country on earth became the scene of the stickiest crime of the century. To understand this insanity, you need to know about Quebec's maple syrup cartel. And yes, that's a real thing. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers doesn't just sound like a boring government agency. It's basically the OPEC of breakfast condiments. These guys control 77% of the world's maple syrup supply. They set prices, control quotas, and maintain a strategic maple syrup reserve that's worth more per gallon than crude oil. We're talking about a sticky monopoly that would make John D. Rockefeller weep tears of pure maple syrup. But in 2011, someone decided to take on the Maple Mafia, and that someone was about to pull off the heist of the century using nothing but fake barrels, forged documents, and bowls the size of Quebec itself. The discovery that started it all. Picture this. July 30th, 2012. It's a sweltering summer day in St. Louis, Dablon-Ford, Quebec, town so small it makes middle of nowhere look like downtown Manhattan. A routine inspection at a massive warehouse facility is about to uncover the crime of the century. The inspector walks through rows upon rows of blue barrels, each one supposedly containing liquid gold. But something feels off. The barrels are there, arranged perfectly, but they're too light, too quiet. And then comes the sound that would echo through Canadian criminal history. Tap, tap, tap. The hollow sound of empty barrels. Not just a few, not just dozens, but thousands of barrels. All empty, all arranged in perfect rows, like a monument to the most audacious theft in Canadian history. 6.6 million pounds of maple syrup gone, vanished, evaporated into thin air like it never existed. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a magic trick performed on an industrial scale. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. This wasn't just any warehouse. This was Quebec's strategic maple syrup reserve, basically Fort Knox for breakfast food. The Federation stored their surplus here, controlling supply to keep prices high. The facility had security cameras, regular inspections, and enough bureaucracy to choke a moose. The barrels were individually numbered, tracked, and monitored. This place was tighter than a jar of crystallized maple syrup. So, how do you steal 6.6 million pounds of syrup from a facility that's basically Canada's sweet tooth savings account? Well, our criminals had a plan so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it would make Ocean's 11 look like amateur hour. The mastermind emerges. Enter Richard, a 38-year-old maple syrup dealer, who looked like he couldn't steal a candy bar from a convenience store, let alone orchestrate the heist of the century. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. Wasn't just any maple syrup dealer. He was a man with connections, ambition, and a grudge against the Federation that burned hotter than a maple tree in October. He'd been dealing syrup for years, watching the Federation control prices while independent producers got squeezed like maple trees, and Richard was about to squeeze back. But first, he needed a plan. A plan so crazy, so perfectly Canadian, that it would go down in criminal history as the sweetest heist ever pulled. The barrel switcheroo. Here's how they did it. And I'm warning you now, this plan is so brilliantly insane that it makes bank robbers look like they're playing checkers, while these guys were playing 4D chess with maple syrup. The thieves didn't just steal the syrup, they replaced it. Over the course of months, they systematically drained barrels, filled them with water, and swapped them with empty ones. They turned the strategic maple syrup reserve into the world's most expensive water storage facility. But here's the kicker. They didn't just dump the water and run. No. These criminal masterminds resealed the barrels, put them back in their exact positions, and made everything look completely normal. They were playing the longest con in Canadian history. The network revealed. This wasn't a one-man operation. Had assembled a crew that read like a who's who of Quebec's maple syrup underworld. We're talking truckers, warehouse workers, and dealers, all connected by sticky fingers and even stickier morals. The operation was so sophisticated that they had their own distribution network. Trucks would arrive at the warehouse, load up with legitimate barrels, drive to transfer points, and then, boom, the Great Maple Syrup Switcheroo. They weren't just stealing syrup, they were running a parallel maple syrup economy. While the Federation thought they were sitting on millions of dollars of liquid gold, the real gold was being sold on the black market at a fraction of the price. The perfect crime, almost for months. Months. This operation ran like clockwork. The thieves were making millions. The Federation was none the wiser, and Canadian breakfast lovers were unknowingly consuming stolen syrup. But here's where hubris meets reality. The criminals got greedy. They started taking bigger risks, moving more syrup. And that's when cracks started appearing in their sweet little operation. Because, in the world of organized crime, there's one rule that never changes. The house always wins. And in this case, the house was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. The investigation begins when the Quebec Provincial Police realized they were dealing with an $18 million maple syrup heist. They didn't just assign a detective, they assembled a task force. Operation Maple became the stickiest investigation in Canadian law enforcement history. The investigators had to untangle a web of fake documents, shell companies, and syrup trails that stretched across Quebec and into New Brunswick. They weren't just following the money, they were following the syrup, gallon by gallon. The first arrest was like pulling a thread on a sweater. Once they got Richard Valley, the whole operation started unraveling faster than a maple leaf in a hurricane. The trials were a media circus. Canadian news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. The Great Maple Syrup Heist became international news, and suddenly Quebec's maple syrup cartel was getting more attention than a Tim Hortons opening in Toronto. But here's where it gets even more insane. During the trials, it came out that the Federation's monopoly was so tight, so controlling, that some people actually supported the thieves. They were seen as maple syrup Robin Hoods, stealing from the rich breakfast elite and giving to the, well, okay, they were selling it for profit. But you get the idea. The trials revealed a world where maple syrup was more valuable than gold, where quotas were enforced like mob territories, and where the sweetest substance on earth had created the most bitter rivalries in Canadian business. Justice, Canadian style in the end. Justice was served, but it was justice with a distinctly Canadian flavor. Richard Valley got 3 years in prison and had to pay back millions in restitution. Other conspirators got lighter sentences, but everyone learned the same lesson. Don't mess with Canada's maple syrup. But here's the twist that makes this story even more insane. The Federation used this heist to justify making their monopoly even stronger. They increased security, tightened controls, and made it even harder for independent producers to compete. So in a weird way, the criminals who tried to break the maple syrup cartel ended up making it more powerful than ever. That's not just irony, that's Canadian justice with a side of maple syrup. But wait, there's more. Because this story doesn't end with prison sentences and restitution payments. Oh no, the Great Maple Syrup Heist created ripple effects that are still being felt today. The heist inspired documentaries, books, and even a Netflix series. Quebec's maple syrup cartel became the subject of international scrutiny. and people started asking uncomfortable questions about how a breakfast condiment could be controlled like a controlled substance. Food economists began studying the Federation as an example of how agricultural monopolies work. Business schools started teaching case studies about the heist, and somewhere in Quebec, maple syrup producers were probably wondering how their sweet little industry became the subject of international criminal investigations. Today, the strategic maple syrup reserve is still there, still storing millions of dollars worth of syrup, but with security that would make Fort Knox jealous. The Federation still controls the majority of world maple syrup production, and prices are still set by committee. But the heist changed everything. It showed that even the most Canadian of crimes could capture international attention. It proved that agricultural monopolies could be just as dramatic as any other cartel. And it demonstrated that when Canadians decide to commit crimes, they do it with the same polite efficiency they apply to everything else. So what's the moral of this sticky story? Maybe it's that monopolies create their own enemies. Maybe it's that Canadian criminals are just as creative as anyone else. Or maybe it's that in a world where breakfast condiments can be worth more than gold, anything is possible. The Great Maple Syrup Heist of 2012 was more than just a crime. It was a window into a world where sweetness and corruption mixed like syrup and pancakes. It showed us that even in the most polite country on earth, where people apologize for other people's mistakes, crime can be just as audacious and just as profitable as anywhere else. And the next time you pour maple syrup on your pancakes, remember, you're not just adding sweetness to your breakfast, you're participating in a global economy so complex, so valuable, and so tightly controlled that people have gone to prison for trying to break it. That's the true story of the Great Maple Syrup Heist, a crime so Canadian, so audacious, and so perfectly executed that it makes every other heist look like child's play. And somewhere in Quebec, there's probably someone right now planning the next great maple syrup cape, because in the world of liquid gold, there's always another score to be made.